The sky was a muted gray as Jamal walked home from the bus stop, his footsteps echoing faintly on the wet pavement. It had been a long day at the community center, where he worked as an outreach coordinator, helping troubled teens find jobs and stay off the streets. His shoulders ached from the weight of responsibility, but there was a quiet pride in knowing he was making a difference. He had come a long way from his days in the inner city, where the odds had been stacked against him. Now, in this suburban neighborhood, he hoped for peace, a fresh start. But there was always something lingering in the air, a tension he couldn't quite escape. The residents of this neighborhood, predominantly white, never outright said it, but Jamal could feel the unease whenever he passed by. He saw it in the way people clutched their bags a little tighter, the way they locked their doors when he walked by. He knew they saw him as an outsider, a stranger who didn't belong. Jamal adjusted the strap of his backpack as he turned the corner onto his street. His house was a modest one-story home, tucked between two larger, more expensive ones. He'd worked hard to get here, saved every penny, and it wasn't just for him. He wanted to give his younger sister, Kayla, a place where she could focus on her studies without the distractions of their old neighborhood. But moving here hadn't been the escape he'd hoped for. As he neared his house, Jamal noticed the familiar hum of a car engine behind him. He glanced over his shoulder and saw a police cruiser creeping slowly down the road, its headlights dim in the early evening light. His heart sank. He had seen that car before, and he knew who was behind the wheel: Officer Derek. The man had a reputation Jamal was all too familiar with. The officer had stopped him twice in the past month, asking the same ridiculous questions about why he was in the neighborhood, if he lived around here, what his business was. Each time, Jamal had answered calmly, showing his ID, giving the officer no reason to detain him. But Derek didn't need a reason. The cruiser pulled up alongside Jamal, its window rolling down with a mechanical whir. Officer Derek's face appeared, cold and hard, his eyes gleaming with something like disdain. "Evening," Derek said, his voice low and casual, but there was an edge to it, the kind of edge that made Jamal's stomach churn. "Out for a stroll?" Jamal kept walking, refusing to rise to the bait. He'd had enough experience with cops like Derek to know that saying the wrong thing could escalate the situation. He wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. "I'm heading home," Jamal replied, his voice steady. "Just getting back from work." Derek's cruiser inched forward, keeping pace with Jamal's steps. "Work, huh? Mind telling me what kind of work a guy like you does?" Jamal bit down on the inside of his cheek, willing himself to stay calm. He stopped and turned to face Derek, his hands in plain sight. "I work at the community center downtown, helping kids stay out of trouble." Derek's lip curled into a smirk. "Helping kids, huh? That's nice, but you wouldn't happen to know anything about a robbery that happened a few blocks over, would you? Fits the description of someone I'm looking for." Jamal's blood ran cold. He'd heard this line before, too many times. The fits the description excuse was a familiar tactic, one used to justify harassment without cause. His hands tightened into fists, but he kept them at his sides, refusing to give Derek the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. "I just told you," Jamal said, his voice firmer now. "I've been at work all day. I don't know anything about a robbery." Derek leaned back in his seat, still watching him with that predatory gaze. "Let me see some ID." Jamal hesitated. He knew how this went. Hand over the ID, let Derek run his name through the system, waste half an hour of his time, and for what? To prove that he belonged in a neighborhood he had every right to live in? But he also knew that refusing would only make things worse. With a slow, deliberate movement, Jamal reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed over his driver's license without a word. Derek snatched it from his hand and examined it, his smirk never faltering. "You sure you live around here, Jamal?" Derek asked, drawing out his name like it was a joke. Jamal nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." The officer's eyes scanned the license, and then he looked back at Jamal, his smirk widening. "You know, you're awfully far from home, considering your people usually stick to a different side of town." Jamal clenched his jaw, feeling the familiar burn of anger rise in his chest. He'd heard it all before. The subtle jabs, the veiled racism. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm just trying to get home, officer." Can I have my ID back? Derek didn't respond right away. He seemed to be enjoying the moment, letting the power imbalance hang in the air. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he handed the license back. You'd better watch yourself, Jamal. Not everyone around here is as understanding as I am. Without another word, Derek rolled up his window and drove off, leaving Jamal standing alone in the street, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on his shoulders. He watched the cruiser disappear down the road, feeling the familiar knot of frustration tighten in his chest. He hated this feeling, this constant reminder that no matter how hard he worked, no matter how much he tried to better himself, to rise above, there were people like Derek waiting to remind him that he didn't belong. But tonight was different. Tonight, something snapped inside him. He wasn't going to just let it go this time. Not anymore. Jamal walked the rest of the way home with a storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. The encounter with Derek replayed in his head like a broken record. This wasn't just about being stopped for no reason. It was about the humiliation, the power play, and the way Derek seemed to enjoy having control over him. Jamal had tried to stay calm, to handle the situation the way he had been taught. Stay polite, don't escalate, don't give them a reason to make things worse. But Derek didn't need a reason. He never did. By the time Jamal reached his front door, his anger had hardened into a quiet resolve. This couldn't continue. He had dealt with harassment his entire life, but something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the fact that he had worked so hard to escape the very things that now followed him into this new neighborhood. Or maybe it was just the exhaustion of constantly being on guard. Whatever it was, Jamal knew he was done being silent. Inside, the house was quiet. His younger sister Kayla was likely in her room studying, as she always was. Jamal made his way through the hallway, dropping his keys on the small table by the door. His body ached from the long day, but his mind was too restless to think about sleep. He had to do something about this. He couldn't keep letting people like Derek run unchecked. As he passed by the living room, he glanced at the family photo on the wall. It was a picture of him, Kayla, and their mother from a few years back. Their mom had been their rock, raising them on her own, working 2 jobs, and never letting them forget the importance of standing up for what's right. She had been tough, but she'd always told Jamal and Kayla to lead with kindness, to believe in the system, to believe that change was possible if you fought for it. But she was gone now. Cancer had taken her 2 years ago, and since then, Jamal had felt like he was fighting this battle alone. He had promised her, on her deathbed, that he would look out for Kayla, that he would keep pushing for justice, for fairness. He couldn't break that promise. Jamal took a deep breath and made his way to the small desk in the corner of the living room. The old laptop hummed to life as he opened it, his fingers quickly navigating to his emails. He typed out a message to Lena Washington, an old friend who had gone on to become a civil rights attorney. They hadn't spoken in a few months, but Lena had always been there when Jamal needed advice on legal matters. The message was brief, but urgent. Lena, I need your help. Something happened tonight with a cop in my neighborhood, and I think it's time to take action. His name is Derek, and he's been harassing me and others for weeks. I'm not the only one, but I need to know what my options are. Can we meet up tomorrow? He hit send and leaned back in his chair, the weight of everything settling on him. Jamal knew this wouldn't be easy. Taking on a cop, especially one like Derek, wasn't just dangerous. It could backfire in ways he didn't want to imagine. But he also knew that if he didn't do something now, he'd be letting Derek and others like him continue to get away with it. The sound of footsteps snapped Jamal out of his thoughts. Kayla appeared in the doorway, her hair tied back in a messy bun, wearing her usual oversized hoodie. She looked at him, concern written across her face. Jamal, you okay? You've been staring at that screen for a while. Jamal smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, I'm fine, just had a long day. Kayla wasn't convinced. She crossed her arms and leaned against the doorframe, her eyes narrowing slightly. Was it that cop again? The one that's been giving you a hard time? Jamal sighed. He hadn't wanted to burden Kayla with this, not when she had so much on her plate with school. But she wasn't a kid anymore. She could handle the truth. Yeah, it was Derek. He stopped me on the way home. Kayla's face tightened with anger. That guy is a piece of work. Why don't you report him? You know he's been doing this to a lot of people, not just you. I know, Jamal said, running a hand over his head. That's what I'm trying to do now. I just emailed Lena. She might be able to help. But it's not as simple as reporting him. You know how it goes. These guys stick together. Even if I file a complaint, who knows if it'll actually go anywhere? Kayla nodded, but her frustration was palpable. Yeah, I get it, but something has to change, Jamal. You can't keep letting this slide. It's not right. Jamal looked at his sister, so much younger than him but already so wise. She was right, of course. He couldn't keep letting it slide. But the reality of what they were up against made him hesitate. It wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about a system that protected people like Derek, that allowed them to operate with impunity. I know, Jamal said softly. I'm going to do something about it. I promise. Kayla gave him a small smile, but the concern never left her eyes. Good. Just be careful, okay? I don't trust that guy. He seems like the type who would do anything to keep himself out of trouble. Jamal nodded. I will. Don't worry. As Kayla headed back to her room, Jamal turned back to his computer. His inbox chimed with a new message. It was from Lena. Let's meet tomorrow at the coffee shop on 8th, 9 a.m. We'll talk then. Stay safe. Jamal exhaled slowly, the weight of what he was about to do settling even heavier on his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the people in this neighborhood who had been targeted, harassed, and intimidated by Derek and officers like him. He wasn't going to let it slide this time. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling. He could hear the faint hum of the neighborhood outside, cars passing by, kids playing down the street. Life went on, seemingly normal, but underneath there was a battle brewing. And Jamal was ready to fight. Tomorrow, things would start to change. Tomorrow, he'd take the first step in holding Derek accountable. The next morning, Jamal sat in a corner booth at the small coffee shop on 8th Street, nervously tapping his fingers on the table. The shop was quiet, the early morning light filtering through the large windows, casting soft shadows across the worn wooden floors. He had ordered a cup of black coffee but barely touched it. His mind was racing, running through all the possible ways this could go wrong. Lena arrived right on time, dressed in her usual professional attire, sharp blazer, pressed pants, her curly hair pulled back in a neat bun. She spotted Jamal immediately and gave him a warm smile as she approached the table. Despite the serious tone of their upcoming conversation, Lena's presence was comforting. They had known each other since their college days, and if there was anyone who could help him navigate this, it was her. Hey, Jamal, she said as she slid into the seat across from him. It's good to see you. Sorry it had to be under these circumstances. Yeah, Jamal muttered, managing a half smile. Thanks for coming. Lena waved it off. Of course. You know I'm always here if you need me. She paused, her expression turning serious. So, tell me what happened. You mentioned an officer, Derek? Jamal leaned forward, lowering his voice as he explained the events of the previous night. He described how Derek had stopped him again, harassed him with no cause, and hinted that he was looking for a way to pin a crime on him. Lena listened intently, her brow furrowing deeper with each detail. She took out a small notepad and started scribbling notes. That's not the first time it's happened, Jamal added. It's been going on for weeks. And it's not just me. I've heard from a couple of neighbors that he's been pulling the same thing with them, especially the Black and Hispanic folks in the area. Lena nodded, still writing. I've heard of this guy, she said after a moment. Derek. He's got a reputation, but nothing's ever stuck. A few complaints here and there, but they always get swept under the rug. You know how it is. Internal investigations that don't go anywhere. Exactly, Jamal said, frustration seeping into his voice. That's why I'm coming to you. I want to make sure this actually goes somewhere this time. I can't just sit back and let him keep doing this. Lena set her notepad down and met Jamal's gaze. You're right. We can't let this slide. But you also have to know what you're getting into. Taking on a police officer, especially one like Derek, isn't easy. It's dangerous. You know how they close ranks. They'll protect him. I know, Jamal said, leaning back in his chair. But I'm tired, Lena. I'm tired of always having to watch my back, of wondering when the next time is going to be. And I'm not just doing this for me. He's doing this to other people too. It's only a matter of time before someone gets seriously hurt, or worse. Lena sat quietly for a moment, tapping her pen against the notepad. All right, she finally said. Here's what we're going to do. First, we need to start gathering evidence. Everything we can. I know you said a couple of people in your neighborhood have had run-ins with him. Can you get them to talk? We're going to need witnesses. Jamal nodded. Yeah, I can do that. A couple of them might be hesitant, though. They don't want any trouble. Understandable, Lena said. But we have to get as many people as possible on the record. The more witnesses we have, the stronger our case. I'll also start digging into his file, see what's been documented so far. If there are patterns of misconduct, we'll use that to build our case. And what about last night? Jamal asked. Is there anything I can do to file a complaint? Or would that just make things worse? Lena thought for a moment. We'll file a complaint, but we won't rely on that alone. Like I said, internal investigations rarely go anywhere, but we'll file it to get it on record. Meanwhile, I'll reach out to some contacts I have in the civil rights community. We need to start applying pressure from multiple angles. Media attention could help too. Jamal raised an eyebrow. Media? You think we should go that route? Eventually, yes, Lena said. Not right away. First, we need to build a solid foundation, get the witnesses, gather evidence, document everything. But once we have enough, we go public. The pressure of public scrutiny might be the only way to push the department into action. Jamal felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had expected this to be a difficult process, but hearing Lena lay it out so clearly made the reality of it sink in. This wasn't just about filing a complaint and hoping for the best. They were going to have to dig deep, expose everything, and make sure it couldn't be ignored. Okay, Jamal said after a pause. I'll talk to the neighbors. I'll get as much as I can. Lena nodded and took a sip of her coffee. Good, and in the meantime, I'll start working on the legal side. We'll need to prepare for any pushback from the department. If they catch wind of this, they'll try to intimidate you. Are you ready for that? Jamal sighed. I'm ready. I mean, I don't know if anyone's ever really ready for that, but I'm not backing down. That's what I needed to hear, Lena said, smiling slightly. But be careful. Derek isn't the type to take this lying down. He'll push back, and when he does, it might get ugly. I know, Jamal said, but if we don't stand up to him, he'll just keep doing it. The conversation shifted to logistics after that. What kind of documentation they'd need, who Lena could reach out to for support, and how to keep everything quiet until they were ready to go public. Jamal's anxiety started to settle a bit as Lena outlined the plan. He trusted her completely, and knowing that she had his back made the whole situation feel a little less daunting. As they wrapped up the meeting, Lena placed a hand on his arm. We're going to get through this, Jamal. Just remember, you're not alone in this fight. You've got a whole community behind you. Jamal nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't alone, and maybe, just maybe, they had a shot at making real change. Later that day, Jamal began reaching out to his neighbors. Most were reluctant to speak out, especially against the police. One neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, a single mother of two, had experienced Derek's harassment multiple times but was terrified of making things worse for her family. She feared that reporting him would only put her children at risk. It's just how it is, Mrs. Rodriguez had told Jamal when he knocked on her door. I don't want to cause any more trouble. I understand, Jamal had replied, his voice soft but firm. But we can't let him keep doing this. I promise, you won't be alone in this. I'm putting together a group. Lena's helping, and we're going to make sure he can't keep getting away with it. She hesitated, biting her lip, but eventually nodded. Okay, I'll talk to Lena, but please, Jamal, be careful. Jamal promised he would, though deep down he knew that this was just the beginning. Derek wouldn't go down without a fight, and when he found out what Jamal was doing, things would likely escalate. But Jamal was ready. He had spent too long staying silent, too long watching people like Derek destroy lives with no accountability. It was time to fight back. As Jamal walked home that evening, the sky growing dark, he could feel the tension in the air. He knew Derek would be watching, waiting for the right moment to strike back. But this time, Jamal wasn't going to be caught off guard. This time, he was just getting started. The following week passed in a blur of tense anticipation. Jamal spent every free moment working with Lena, collecting statements from neighbors and researching Officer Derek's history. Word spread quietly through the neighborhood about what Jamal was doing, and slowly, more people began to come forward. It was as though a floodgate had opened. People who had kept silent out of fear now saw a chance for change. Mr. Jacobs, an older black man who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, shared his story with Jamal and Lena one afternoon. He spoke about how Derek had harassed him repeatedly over the past few months, accusing him of petty crimes, searching him on the sidewalk in front of his own home, and even making veiled threats about how things could get worse if Mr. Jacobs didn't comply. "They don't care about us," Mr. Jacobs said bitterly, shaking his head. "They see us, and we're guilty just for existing. I'm glad you're doing something, Jamal. We've all been too scared to speak up, but maybe this time we can actually make a difference." Jamal listened to each story, feeling the anger inside him build with every account. It wasn't just him, it never had been. Derek had been terrorizing people in the community for months, and no one had done anything about it. Until now. Lena had begun compiling the statements into a detailed report, preparing for the legal battle that was sure to come. She filed Jamal's complaint with the police department, but as expected, it didn't go anywhere. The department issued a standard response, promising an internal review, but Jamal knew it was a stalling tactic. They didn't take it seriously, not yet. But things were about to change. One evening, after another long day of work at the community center, Jamal returned home to find a small envelope tucked into his mailbox. There was no return address, but the envelope had his name typed neatly across the front. He frowned, glancing around the street to see if anyone was watching, but everything seemed quiet. Cautiously, he opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper. The message was short but chilling. "Stop what you're doing, or you'll regret it." Jamal stared at the note, his heart pounding. There was no signature, no clue as to who had sent it, but he knew without a doubt where it had come from. This was Derek's way of sending a warning. He wanted Jamal to back off, to stop pushing for justice. For a moment, Jamal considered it. This was exactly what he had feared. The threat of retaliation, the knowledge that Derek and the people who protected him could make life even more difficult. But the moment passed quickly. He had come too far to stop now. He couldn't let fear control him. Jamal crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. He wasn't going to back down. The next morning, he called Lena to tell her about the note. "Sounds like he's starting to feel the pressure," Lena said. "It's a good sign." Jamal chuckled dryly. "A good sign? He's threatening me, Lena." I know, she said, her tone serious. "But listen, it means we're getting to him. He wouldn't bother sending you a message if he wasn't worried. It's proof that what we're doing is working." Jamal was quiet for a moment. "So what do we do now?" "We keep going," Lena said firmly. "We keep building the case, and once we've got everything in place, we go public." The plan was risky, but it was the best option they had. If they could get enough attention, enough public pressure, then the department wouldn't be able to ignore Derek's misconduct anymore. Jamal just had to be prepared for the storm that would come when they finally made everything public. Over the next few days, Lena worked tirelessly to prepare for the inevitable confrontation. She contacted local media outlets, carefully gauging their interest in the story without revealing too much too soon. The local news had reported on police misconduct cases in the past, but getting them to take on something as sensitive as this would require solid evidence. Lena was confident that they would get the coverage they needed, but it was all a matter of timing. Meanwhile, Jamal continued gathering more testimonies from the neighborhood. With each new statement, the scope of Derek's abuse became clearer. He had operated with impunity for years. And it wasn't just about racial profiling, it was about power. He harassed, intimidated, and sometimes outright threatened anyone he deemed out of place, using his badge as a weapon to control and humiliate people of color. One evening, as Jamal was reviewing the latest testimonies, His phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to answer, but his curiosity got the better of him. Hello? Jamal? The voice on the other end was low and familiar, but Jamal couldn't immediately place it. It's Greg, Officer Greg Wilson. Jamal's stomach tightened. Greg was Derek's partner, the officer who had stood by silently during Jamal's first two encounters with Derek. He had never spoken up, never intervened. Jamal had assumed Greg was just like Derek, complicit if not actively involved. "What do you want?" Jamal asked, his tone cold. "I heard about what you're doing," Greg said, his voice quiet, almost nervous. "And I want to help." Jamal blinked in surprise. "Help? Why would you want to help me?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by a heavy sigh. "Because you're right, about Derek, about everything. I should have said something a long time ago, but I was scared. I'm still scared, but I can't keep pretending like this isn't happening, not anymore." Jamal's heart raced. Could this be the break they needed? If Greg, Derek's own partner, was willing to testify, it could change everything. "Why now?" Jamal asked, still wary. "Why are you speaking up now?" "Because I can't live with it anymore," Greg replied, his voice shaking slightly. "I know what Derek's doing is wrong, and it's not just him. There are others. But if I come forward, if I testify, I need to know that I'll be protected. You know how this works, Jamal. If I turn on him, I'm putting a target on my back." Jamal leaned forward in his chair, his mind racing. This was huge. Greg could be the key to bringing Derek down, to exposing the wider corruption in the department. But it came with risks, big ones. If Greg turned on Derek, there was no telling what Derek or the other officers might do in retaliation. "I get it," Jamal said after a moment. "I can't promise it'll be easy, but if you're willing to do this, I'll make sure Lena knows. She'll do everything she can to protect you." Greg let out a long breath. "All right, I'll meet with you and your lawyer, but we have to move fast. Derek's already suspicious, and if he finds out I'm talking to you—" Jamal nodded, though Greg couldn't see him. "I understand. We'll set up a meeting as soon as possible." They arranged to meet at Lena's office the next day. Jamal ended the call, his pulse still racing. This was it. Greg's testimony could be the final piece they needed to bring everything crashing down. But as excited as Jamal was, there was also a gnawing fear in the back of his mind. If Derek found out what they were doing before they were ready, the consequences could be dire. The next morning, Jamal met with Lena and Greg in the small, nondescript office where Lena handled most of her civil rights cases. Greg looked tense, his eyes constantly flicking toward the door as if expecting Derek to burst in at any moment. But once he started talking, it all came pouring out. The corruption, the abuse, the way Derek and other officers had manipulated evidence and intimidated witnesses to cover their tracks. Lena recorded everything, taking detailed notes as Greg laid out the full extent of what was happening inside the department. It was worse than Jamal had imagined. Derek wasn't just harassing people. He was actively fabricating reports, planting drugs on suspects, and using excessive force whenever he felt like it. This is huge," Lena said once Greg had finished. "If we can verify everything you've said, we can take this to the media. They won't be able to ignore it." Greg nodded, though he still looked uneasy. "Just make sure I don't get thrown under the bus for this. I'm putting everything on the line here." "We'll protect you," Lena assured him, "but we need to act fast." Jamal left the meeting feeling both energized and anxious. They were getting closer, but the danger was increasing with every step they took. Derek was already suspicious, and it was only a matter of time before he realized what was happening. The pressure was mounting, and soon everything would come to a head. The storm that Jamal had feared finally broke the day after his meeting with Greg. It started with whispers in the neighborhood, hushed conversations about police cruisers being seen parked outside the homes of those who had spoken to Lena. The community, once cautiously optimistic about the prospect of justice, was now on edge. There was an unspoken understanding. Derek had realized what was happening, and he was trying to intimidate everyone involved. Jamal had expected this. He had known that Derek wouldn't go down without a fight, but seeing the fear spread through the neighborhood made it real in a way that shook him. The weight of what they were doing felt heavier now, the stakes higher than ever. Lena had anticipated this escalation and moved quickly. She doubled down on security measures, advising the witnesses and Jamal to be vigilant, to stay in groups, and to avoid unnecessary risks. But even with those precautions, the tension was palpable. Every shadow seemed more menacing. Every glance from a passing officer felt like a threat. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the situation finally reached its boiling point. Jamal was at the community center, helping one of the teens with his resume, when his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced down, expecting another update from Lena, but his breath caught in his throat when he saw the name on the screen. Kayla. His sister rarely called him during the day, especially when she knew he was at work. Something was wrong. Kayla? Jamal answered quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. What's going on? Jamal, there's a cop outside. He's been sitting in his car for hours, Kayla said, her voice low and trembling. I'm scared. What should I do? Jamal's blood ran cold. He knew immediately who it was. Derek. He was sending a message, not just to Jamal, but to everyone who had dared to stand against him. Jamal clenched his jaw, trying to keep his voice steady for Kayla's sake. Don't go outside, he said firmly. Lock the doors, close the blinds, and stay away from the windows. I'll be home as soon as I can. Kayla's voice was barely a whisper. What if he tries to come inside? He won't, Jamal said, though he wasn't entirely sure. Just do what I said, and I'll be there soon. He hung up and immediately called Lena. She picked up on the second ring, her voice tense. Jamal, I was just about to call you. I've been hearing from people all morning. Cops have been showing up outside their houses. They're trying to intimidate us. I know, Jamal said, his heart racing. Derek's outside my house right now. Kayla's inside and she's scared. What do we do? Lena was silent for a moment, thinking. Okay, listen to me. You need to stay calm. Derek's not going to do anything outright. He's just trying to scare you. But we can't let this continue. We need to make a move now. Go public? Jamal asked, his voice tight. Yes, Lena replied. We've got enough now. Between Greg's testimony and the statements from the witnesses, we have a solid case. I've already been in touch with a few reporters who are interested in the story. If we push this into the spotlight, Derek and his friends won't be able to touch you or anyone else. Jamal took a deep breath. This was it. The moment they had been working toward for weeks, but it felt like stepping into a minefield. Once the story went public, there was no going back. Derek would be exposed, and the department would be forced to respond. But it also meant they would be putting themselves directly in the line of fire. All right, Jamal said, his voice steady now. Let's do it. Lena laid out the plan. They would gather the key witnesses, including Greg, and have them ready to go public with their stories. Lena would handle the legal side, ensuring that they were protected from any immediate retaliation. Meanwhile, Jamal would prepare for the media interviews that were bound to follow. By the time Jamal reached his house, Derek's cruiser was gone, but the tension in the air remained. Kayla met him at the door, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. She had done what he asked, locked all the doors and windows, pulled the blinds down, and stayed out of sight. But even with Derek gone, the fear lingered. He was just sitting there, Kayla said, her voice shaking, watching the house. I didn't know what to do. Jamal pulled her into a hug, trying to calm her nerves. It's going to be okay, Kay. We're handling it. You're sure? Kayla asked, pulling back slightly to search his face. I don't want you to get hurt, Jamal. I'm sure, he lied, trying to keep the worry from showing in his eyes. We've got a plan, and we're going to expose him. He won't be able to do this to us or anyone else anymore. Kayla nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. Just be careful. The next few days were a whirlwind. Lena worked tirelessly, organizing interviews with local news stations and preparing the witnesses to go public. She had coordinated with Greg, ensuring that his testimony would remain anonymous for as long as possible, at least until they could secure additional protection for him. The media caught wind of the story quickly, and by the end of the week, news outlets were buzzing with headlines about police corruption and racial profiling in the suburban community. Jamal sat down with one of the local reporters in the living room of Lena's office, his hands gripping the edges of the chair as the camera crew set up. His heart raced as he prepared for what was about to happen. This was his chance to expose everything, to make sure Derek was held accountable. But as the reporter sat down across from him, her microphone pinned to her shirt, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much bigger battle. The reporter smiled kindly, sensing his nerves. "Jamal, thank you for speaking with us today. We know this isn't easy." Jamal nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, but it's important." She asked him about Derek, about the incidents that had led up to this moment. Jamal spoke clearly and calmly, recounting each time Derek had stopped him, each veiled threat, each moment of fear and humiliation. He talked about how it wasn't just him, that this was happening to others in the neighborhood, people who were too scared to speak up until now. "We're not trying to make enemies," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We just want justice. We want to be able to walk down our own streets without being harassed. We want to feel safe in our own neighborhood. That's not too much to ask." The reporter nodded, her expression serious. "And you believe that Officer Derek has been targeting you and others because of your race?" "There's no doubt in my mind," Jamal said firmly. "And it's not just Derek. There are others in the department who know what's going on. They've been covering for him. But we have evidence now. Testimonies, documents. We're not backing down." The interview wrapped up, and as the camera crew packed away their equipment, Lena gave Jamal an encouraging smile. "You did great," she said. "Now we just wait for the fallout." And the fallout came quickly. Within hours of the interview airing, social media exploded with outrage. The hashtag Justice for Jamal began trending, and local news stations picked up the story, airing segments on the growing allegations against Officer Derek and the police department. The public pressure was mounting, and soon it became impossible for the department to ignore. The following week was a whirlwind of media coverage, community rallies, and public outcry. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading beyond the local community to national outlets. Headlines about police corruption and racial profiling filled news feeds, and people all across the country began demanding justice for Jamal and others like him who had been targeted by Derek and his colleagues. The pressure was working. The police department, overwhelmed by the media scrutiny and the growing number of complaints coming to light, announced an official investigation into Officer Derek. The announcement was met with cautious optimism. Too many times before, internal investigations had led to nothing. But this time felt different. This time, the eyes of the world were watching. Jamal, however, wasn't celebrating just yet. The backlash was brutal. He received dozens of threatening messages every day, both online and in person. People accused him of trying to destroy good cops and stir up trouble where none existed. He knew that Derek and his allies wouldn't go down without a fight, and the closer they got to real justice, the more dangerous things became. The tension hit its peak one evening when Jamal was heading home from the community center. It was late, the streets dark and quiet. As he rounded the corner onto his block, he spotted a familiar figure leaning against his car. Derek. Jamal froze for a moment, his mind racing. What was Derek doing here? Was he trying to intimidate him again? Or worse? Summoning his courage, Jamal walked toward his car, keeping his pace steady even though his heart was pounding. As he got closer, Derek stood up straight, his face twisted into a cold sneer. "You think you've won, huh?" Derek spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Jamal stopped a few feet away, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'm just doing what's right. You should try it sometime." Derek's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Jamal wondered if the officer would lash out. But instead, Derek took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "You don't know what you've started, Jamal. You think this is over just because you've got the media on your side? I'm not going down that easy. And trust me, when this is all said and done, you're going to wish you'd kept your mouth shut." Jamal's pulse quickened, but he refused to back down. He met Derek's gaze head-on. "You can threaten me all you want. It doesn't change the fact that you're going down. People know what you've done. They've seen it, and there's no hiding from it now." For a long, tense moment, the two men stood facing each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging in the air between them. Jamal could feel the anger radiating off Derek, but he wasn't scared anymore. He was tired of being scared. Finally, Derek let out a harsh laugh, stepping back with a shake of his head. "You're a fool, Jamal. You don't even know what you're up against." Without another word, Derek turned and walked back to his cruiser, slamming the door behind him before driving off into the night. Jamal stood there for a moment, letting the adrenaline fade before slowly making his way into his house. The confrontation had left him shaken, but it had also strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone Derek had hurt, everyone who had been too scared to speak up. He couldn't stop now. The next day, things took an unexpected turn. Lena called Jamal early in the morning, her voice urgent. "Jamal, are you watching the news?" "No," Jamal said, still groggy from sleep. "What's going on? Turn it on, now." Jamal fumbled for the remote and flipped to the local news station. The screen was filled with images of police officers, some in uniform, others in plainclothes, being led out of the police station in handcuffs. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Corruption Scandal Rocks Local Police Department. Multiple Officers Arrested." Jamal's heart leaped into his throat as he watched the footage. It wasn't just Derek. A dozen officers were being taken into custody, including some of the higher-ups who had been covering for him. The investigation had uncovered a web of corruption far deeper than anyone had expected. Bribery, falsified reports, illegal searches, and worse. "They finally did it," Lena said, her voice filled with a mix of relief and disbelief. "The department couldn't cover it up anymore. The evidence we collected, along with Greg's testimony, it blew the whole thing wide open." Jamal sat in stunned silence, watching as Derek was led out of the station in handcuffs, his face pale and tight with fury. It didn't feel real. After all the fear, all the threats, all the sleepless nights, it was finally happening. Derek and his allies were being held accountable. "We did it," Jamal whispered, more to himself than to Lena. "Yeah," Lena replied. "We did." But even in the midst of the victory, Jamal knew the fight wasn't over. There would be trials, legal battles, and undoubtedly more attempts to discredit him and the other witnesses. And beyond that, there was the larger issue, the system that had allowed Derek and officers like him to operate unchecked for so long. Jamal and Lena spent the next few weeks preparing for the court hearings. Greg had been placed under protection, his testimony vital to the case against Derek and the other officers. The media frenzy continued, but Jamal tried to stay focused on the work ahead. There was still so much to do. The day of Derek's trial arrived, and Jamal sat in the courtroom, his heart pounding as the proceedings began. He listened as witness after witness took the stand, recounting the harassment, the threats, the abuse they had suffered at Derek's hands. Each testimony was like a weight lifting off Jamal's shoulders, proof that he hadn't been alone in this fight, that there were others who had suffered and survived just like him. When it was Greg's turn to testify, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. The room was silent as Greg, pale but determined, described the corruption he had witnessed. He spoke about the falsified reports, the illegal searches, the way Derek had manipulated the system to protect himself. His testimony was damning, and as he spoke, Jamal could see the realization dawning on the jury's faces. This wasn't just a case of one bad cop. This was a systematic failure, and it was time to reckon with it. By the time the trial was over, there was little doubt about the outcome. Derek was convicted, and several of his colleagues faced charges as well. The department was forced to issue a public apology, promising widespread reforms and accountability measures to prevent something like this from happening again. As Jamal left the courthouse that day, surrounded by reporters and supporters, he felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the end of the fight, not by a long shot, but it was a victory, a small but important step toward justice. Lena walked beside him, her expression tired but triumphant. "You did it," she said quietly. "We did it," Jamal corrected, smiling at her. This was a team effort. They paused at the top of the courthouse steps, looking out at the crowd gathered below, the people who had come to support them, to demand justice, to fight for change. It was a reminder that, no matter how hard the fight got, they were never truly alone. Jamal took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the journey behind him and the road still ahead. He wasn't naive. He knew there were more battles to come, more systemic issues to confront, more people to protect. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. As he and Lena descended the steps, Jamal raised his fist in the air, a signal of victory, of defiance, of hope for the future. The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices rising in unison. This was just the beginning.